It begins in the quiet stillness of a Texas dawn, the horizon painted in muted shades of pale, amber, and grey, fields stretching endlessly, yet carrying the burden of scarcity. The air holds the faint smell of dry soil, of earth cracked open by the relentless sun. A rooster crows somewhere in the distance, its call absorbed by the vast silence that rolls across the plains. Dust hangs in the morning air, suspended like a memory that refuses to settle. This is where the story of Bonnie and Clyde first breathes, not in gunfire, not in roaring engines, but in dust and hunger, in the stillness of empty kitchens and the tired eyes of parents who labored against forces far larger than themselves. Childhood begins, here not in innocence exactly, but in the fragile spaces where hope and hardship meet. Many people still think that the making of a criminal begins with a single act of defiance, but more often it begins in the quiet architecture of need fields that yield little, neighborhoods pressed against the margins, and families whose hands grow calloused long before their children can dream. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born in 1910 in Rowena, Texas, a small, dusty town with fewer than 1,000 residents. Her father, a bricklayer, died when she was just 4 years old. Her mother, Emma, packed up what little they had and moved Bonnie and her siblings to the industrial suburbs of Dallas. In those crowded neighborhoods, the smell of factories and the clang of steel replaced the wide open silence of the fields. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born the following year, in 1911, to a family of poor farmers. His childhood unfolded along dirt, roads, and the creaking boards of a tenant shack. In 1922, the family moved to West Dallas, a neighborhood notorious even then for its rough edges, where poverty carved out a permanent place in the lives of its residents. Their shack was so small it lacked plumbing, and water had to be hauled in buckets from nearby wells. The Great Depression had not yet come, but the soil of hardship was already being tilled. Families lived at the mercy of failing crops and uncertain wages. Automobiles were still a novelty for most, radios a luxury, electricity unreliable. In places like Rowena and West Dallas, children absorbed the daily lesson that survival meant improvisation, and improvisation, in time, becomes a habit of mind. Picture Clyde as a small boy, wiry, restless, his hair always just a little disheveled, shoes scuffed by endless running through alleys and open lots. The world offered him few comforts, but it offered freedom, the kind that only poor children know when the streets become both playground and schoolhouse. He watched his older siblings navigate the rough realities of the neighborhood, and he learned quickly that strength wasn't measured in muscles, but in cleverness. Bonnie's childhood, by contrast, had its own texture. Teachers later remembered her as intelligent, quick-witted, and possessed of a surprising confidence for a girl so small. She carried notebooks filled with scribbled poems, dreams etched in the looping cursive of a child who saw the world as something to be captured in words. She loved theater, music, the promise of performance. Yet, beneath it, there was always the quiet absence left by her father's death, missing anchor in a home that struggled to stay steady. So, what do you think? When a girl dreams of the stage while knowing hunger, and when a boy learns to run before he learns to read properly, are the seeds already being planted? Or are these just shadows we cast backward, looking for patterns in lives that could have gone many ways? There's a story that West Dallas was sometimes called the Devil's Back Porch. It was a place where houses leaned with exhaustion, where unpaved streets turned to rivers of mud after rain, and where the nights carried both music and menace. Families huddled together, building what shelter they could. Children learned early that opportunity was scarce, and survival often depended on bending rules that seemed designed only for those who already had more. For Clyde, this environment became both crucible and teacher. He watched older boys return, home in cars that seemed far beyond their means, watched them swagger through streets lined with laundry hung out to dry. He absorbed the unspoken lesson. Power belonged not to those who followed the rules, but to those who created their own. For Bonnie, Dallas was a different kind of teacher. She saw women in cafes, dressed neatly, speaking in hushed tones. She read novels borrowed from friends and imagined herself in other places and stages, in cities where the dust never seemed to settle. Yet she also helped her mother with housework, felt the sting of economic reality pressing in. In time, those contradictions the dreamer and the realist would braid themselves into the woman she became. Many people still think that poverty simply hardens children, but often it also awakens a sharp sensitivity. Clyde grew attuned to the nuances of authority, the way men in uniforms carried themselves, the way landlords spoke to his parents, the way a family could be made to feel small with just a glance. From this, a paradox formed. Outwardly restless, inwardly calculating. A boy who would later crave control because so much of his early world had been beyond his reach. Bonnie, in her quiet notebooks, cultivated another paradox. She dreamed of love and romance. Yet her earliest understanding of relationships was colored by absence, the absence of a father, the absence of stability, the absence of permanence. It left her both fiercely loyal and deeply fearful of abandonment. That duality, yearning for closeness, fearing loss, would echo in every choice she made. And together, those paradoxes, his hunger for control, her hunger for connection, would one day converge. The Texas sky darkens again as evening falls, the same dust rising now in softer shades of rose and purple. The fields hum with crickets, and the air cools at last. In houses both in Rowena and West Dallas, families gather around small wooden tables, bread shared sparingly, conversations hushed by weariness. Bonnie sits near a window, notebook in hand, tracing words by lamplight while her siblings sleep. Clyde lies awake in his family's cramped shack, listening to the creak of boards and the far-off sound of dogs barking into the night. Both children, in different places, are already shaping the private languages of their futures, the poems and the plans, the whispers and the watchfulness. Nothing dramatic yet. No headlines, just children, dust, and the fields that seem to stretch on forever. Yet in those fields, in that dust, something invisible is forming. Something that will one day shake America. For now, let the scene soften. Let the night settle. Over the plains, let the dust rise and then fall quietly, until sleep claims the restless. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and ink. Sunlight crept reluctantly through tall, narrow windows, streaking across wooden desks carved with initials of children who had long since left. The air was warm, heavy with the mingled scents of pencil shavings, wool coats, and floorboards that had soaked up years of restless footsteps. At the front, a blackboard waited in silence, its surface layered with faint, ghostly traces of yesterday's lessons. Children filled the room each morning, with the uneven music of youth, the shuffling of feet, the scrape of chairs, the whispered gossip passed between rows. Yet beneath the noise, a quiet tension lingered. In these small schools, scattered across Texas towns and neighborhoods, discipline was firm, expectations modest, and futures uncertain. The walls carried the weight of both hope and resignation. It was here, in such rooms, that Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow first revealed themselves, not yet as criminals, not yet as fugitives, but as children whose personalities strained against confinement. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. Bonnie attended the newly built Cement City elementary school after her family relocated to West Dallas in 1914. Clyde, younger by a year, began his schooling in similar neighborhood classrooms not far away. Both institutions operated under the educational philosophy of early 20th century Texas: rigid structure, moral instruction, and minimal tolerance for disruption. Teachers were often young women, paid poorly, their authority both respected and quietly tested. Class sizes swelled with children from working-class families, sons of factory hands, daughters of seamstresses, many of them coming to school hungry, carrying the fatigue of household chores completed before dawn. Textbooks were shared, sometimes tattered. Arithmetic drills, penmanship exercises, patriotic recitations filled the hours. Yet behind these simple lessons, the atmosphere of poverty remained palpable. Lunchboxes were light, shoes worn thin, and the specter of dropping out hovered close, especially for boys expected to help support their families. So, what do you think? How does a child learn patience when their stomach is empty, or obedience when their life outside the classroom is ruled by hardship? Bonnie Parker was, by most accounts, a bright and eager student. Teachers noticed her sharp wit and her love for language. She excelled in spelling, enjoyed reciting poetry, and displayed a knack for composition. When asked to write short stories, she often infused them with a touch of romance, daydreaming through her pencil as though the classroom walls could not contain her imagination. Her classmates remembered her as lively, quick to laugh, and gifted at drawing people toward her. She was small in stature, often described as pretty, with expressive eyes that carried both warmth and defiance. Yet beneath the charm, there was a quiet temper and unwillingness to be dismissed or ignored. When slighted, she responded not with violence, but with words sharpened to a fine point. There's a story that during one spelling lesson, Bonnie corrected a teacher's mispronunciation. The class erupted in nervous laughter, but Bonnie did not shrink. Instead, she leaned into the silence that followed, her confidence startling in a girl so young. That moment, though small, offers a glimpse of the inner steel that would one day define her. Clyde Barrow's schooling, on the other hand, was more uneven. He struggled with the structure of lessons, restless and often distracted. Teachers remembered him as intelligent but unfocused, his attention drifting toward the world outside the window. He doodled images of cars, trains, and musical instruments, his mind already drawn toward motion and noise rather than the stillness of chalk and paper. Yet, Clyde possessed a charm of his own. He could be mischievous, quick with a grin, skilled at winning allies among classmates. He was small, like Bonnie, and sometimes teased for it. But when cornered, his temper flared. He disliked humiliation, resisted authority, and carried grievances longer than most children. His defiance was quiet at first, refusal to sit still, a muttered comment under his breath, but it marked the beginning of a pattern. Many people still think that defiance in school is simply childish rebellion, but often it is the early rehearsal of a lifelong posture, resistance against any structure that feels constraining, any voice that seeks to command. For Clyde, school was not a place of belonging. It was a place that taught him what he did not want to be: a follower, a silent face in rows of obedience, In the early 1920s, the West Dallas school system was already stretched thin. The neighborhood swelled with migrant families who had come, seeking work, and classrooms were filled beyond their intended capacity. Illiteracy rates were high, and school attendance was often inconsistent. Meanwhile, the larger cultural forces of Texas loomed outside the schoolhouse walls. Prohibition would soon reshape communities, creating underground economies that children like Clyde could not help but notice. Automobiles, once rare, became more common, and for young boys, the sound of an engine promised a freedom that lessons in arithmetic could not rival. For young girls like Bonnie, the era offered its own contradictions. Women had only recently secured the right to vote in 1920. Social expectations still pressed them toward domestic life, yet the world hinted at broader possibilities. In Dallas, movie theaters played silent films featuring bold heroines, and radios carried songs of rebellion and romance. Bonnie absorbed these cultural whispers, storing them alongside her own ambitions. Both children revealed early contradictions. Bonnie's intelligence carried her forward, yet her pride made her vulnerable to conflict. She longed for recognition, for a life larger than the small rooms of her childhood, yet she also nurtured a deep loyalty to family and community. These dual impulses, ambition and devotion, would later weave into her fateful choices. Clyde, too, embodied paradox. He was both cooperative and resistant, charming and stubborn. He wanted approval but rejected submission. His imagination carried him beyond the lesson plans of his teachers, yet his defiance ensured he would never fully benefit from formal schooling. This restless dissatisfaction, born in the classroom, would later drive him to seek fulfillment elsewhere in the fast life of cars, music, and risk. So what do you think? Are these contradictions the seeds of tragedy? Or are they simply the universal struggles of youth, made sharper only by the weight of poverty and time? The school day ends. Desks scrape, chairs clatter, the hum of voices spills into the hallway. The air outside smells of dust and warm tar, sunlight glinting off tin roofs and dirt roads. Bonnie walks home clutching her notebooks, her mind filled with half-formed poems and dreams of a stage that might someday be hers. Clyde lingers with friends, kicking stones along the road, imagining the roar of an engine beneath his feet. Both children carry home more than books. They carry impressions, grievances, and small victories, the quiet tempers of classrooms that could never quite contain them. And as the Texas evening settles, shadows stretching long across the schoolyard, one can almost hear the silence, waiting for these children to grow into the restless adults they would become, waiting for the dust of empty classrooms to rise into something far larger, something history would never forget. For now, though, the lesson is simple. The making of a legend begins not in violence, but in silence, in the chalk dust that lingers after the day has ended, in the tempers and dreams of children who looked out the window and saw another life calling. The nights in West Dallas did not arrive quietly. They settled like a weight across the wooden shacks, pulling families into a kind of restless silence. The day's heat lingered in the walls, clinging to fabric, pressing against skin. Children tossed in narrow beds, listening to the groan of floorboards, the sigh of wind through cracks in the boards, and the distant bark of stray dogs scavenging for scraps. Hunger, too, settled into those nights, not as a sudden pang, but as a constant whisper. It hollowed the stomach, gently, steadily, until it became another companion in the darkness. For Clyde Barrow, hunger carried the shape of uncertainty. His Family's meals were simple, sometimes meager, and though his parents stretched what little they had, the feeling of scarcity was always there, waiting at the edges of his childhood. He learned early that food was not just sustenance, but a symbol of power. Whoever controlled it controlled comfort. And when comfort was absent, imagination filled the gap. He dreamed of tables heavy with meat, of fruit piled in bowls, of the kind of abundance he rarely saw in reality. These dreams grew sharper when he glimpsed richer neighborhoods, where curtains glowed warmly and porches hinted at meals he could only imagine. Bonnie Parker knew hunger in another way. After her father's death, her mother worked tirelessly to keep the children fed. But there were nights when bread was thin and stew stretched too far. Bonnie carried her hunger into her notebooks, writing poems that mixed longing with fantasy. She imagined banquets, imagined love that filled more than the stomach, imagined futures where scarcity was replaced by beauty. Hunger, for her, was not only about food. It was about the ache for more than survival, the yearning for something beyond the dusty streets of Cement City. There's a story that Clyde, when still very young, once watched his mother serve the last piece of bread to a younger sibling. He said nothing, but the silence etched itself into him. Many people still think that the lessons of childhood fade, but they do not. They settle like shadows at the edge of consciousness. That moment when need outweighed fairness left him with the quiet conclusion that the world would never provide equally, and that to take what one wanted might someday feel justified. The historical world around them deepened these lessons. In the early 1920s, Texas families like theirs often lived one failed harvest away from hunger. Tenant farming left families vulnerable to the whims of weather and landlords. Industrial jobs promised wages, but wages were small, and children often carried the burden of supplementing the household through odd jobs, errands, or early work. Hunger, then, was not just a private matter. It was woven into the social fabric, a reminder of inequality, of the way the system allowed some to eat well while others scraped by. In West Dallas, the contrast was visible, just across the Trinity. River, wealthier districts thrived, lit by electric lamps and humming with automobiles. For children like Bonnie and Clyde, the proximity of abundance made their own scarcity sharper, almost mocking. Clyde's first brush with theft, whispered, about years later, began not with grand intentions but with the simple need to quiet hunger. An apple left on a store counter, a loaf of bread cooling by an open window. These were temptations almost designed to test a boy's patience. He was small, quick, and invisible in ways children of poverty often are. When questioned later in life, he would never describe such moments as beginnings. But beginnings are rarely recognized when they arrive. They are felt, absorbed, carried silently, as natural as breathing. Bonnie's rebellion, at that same tender age, did not take the form of theft. Her defiance was internal. She refused to accept the idea that scarcity defined her worth. At school, Clyde learned that survival sometimes required stepping outside the lines. Together, unknowingly, they were walking parallel paths that would one day converge. The night deepens further. Oil lamps flicker, then fade. The crickets sing louder. A monotonous lull that wraps itself around the shacks of West Dallas. The smell of dust lingers, settling over everything. Children drift to uneasy sleep, bellies half-filled, dreams fragile and fleeting. Hunger does not leave with sleep. It waits, it lingers, it shapes. And so the chapter closes in silence. Two children, separated by blocks of weathered wood and dirt roads, lie beneath the same Texas sky. Their futures remain unwritten, but already the world has placed its mark upon them. Hunger has taught them resilience, and hunger has taught them longing. Hunger, in its quiet way, has given them a face to chase, a face they will never quite stop pursuing. For now, let the night soften around them, let the dust settle once more, let the hollow ache of hunger fade into the rhythm of breath, into the fragile peace of sleep. The alleys of West Dallas at dusk were not places of safety. They were narrow veins carved between sagging houses and tin-roofed sheds, lined with broken fences and the scattered remains of lives lived too close to the edge. The smell was always a mixed-hued smoke from coal stoves, and the faint sourness of refuse tossed behind stores. Children played there during the day, kicking stones, daring each other to climb fences or peek into boarded windows. But as the sun dipped low, the alleys shifted character. Shadows grew longer, voices grew sharper, and the air itself carried a weight of unspoken warnings. It was in such a place, one evening, when the lamps had just begun to glow, that Clyde Barrow first felt the hand of another world reach toward him. He was still a boy, not yet a teenager, small enough that older boys towered over him, old enough that curiosity burned like a restless fire. He had slipped into the alley chasing the sound of music, someone's radio faintly playing a blues tune from inside a nearby house. The sound was thin, crackling through static, but to Clyde it carried the flavor of freedom. Music was always like that for him, a reminder that there existed another rhythm, another life beyond the ordinary. March of hunger and chores. From the shadow of a doorway, a man called out to him. Not a neighbor, not a relative, but a figure older, wrapped in the aura of danger that children instinctively recognize. The man's voice was low, deliberate, almost inviting. He asked Clyde what he was doing alone. Clyde hesitated. The man's coat was worn, but not ragged, his shoes scuffed but polished. His eyes, sharp and amused, studied the boy the way gamblers study a table before laying down their bets. There's a story that Clyde, in that moment, lied for the first time to a stranger. He said he was waiting for a brother, though no brother was coming. The lie came easily, as though it had been waiting on his tongue. The man laughed, not mocking but approving, and pulled from his pocket a small piece of fruit, a pear, slightly bruised. He offered it with a gesture that was both generous and unsettling. Clyde took it, not because he trusted the man, but because hunger and curiosity outweighed fear. The sweetness of the fruit lingered on his tongue long after the stranger drifted away, disappearing into the folds of the alley as though he had never been there at all. Many people still think that the entry into criminal life is dramatic, a single act that announces itself with clarity, but more often it is subtle. It begins with the realization that rules can be bent, that strangers who exist on the edge of the law can also offer gifts, that temptation often arrives, dressed not in menace but in generosity. That evening, Clyde carried home the memory of the man's voice, the glint in his eyes, the way danger could masquerade as kindness. For Bonnie Parker, the first brushes with this other world came not in alleys, but in stories whispered by classmates and neighbors. Older boys bragged about errands they ran for men who carried themselves differently, who wore sharper suits and spoke with a confidence not found in factory workers. Bonnie, always listening, absorbed these stories the way she absorbed songs from the radio or lines of poetry from books. She was too young to step into those shadows herself, but she understood even then that some people moved through life without waiting for permission. And that idea, once planted, never left her. The broader world reinforced these impressions. In 1923, Dallas was a city of contrasts. Downtown gleamed with theaters, banks, and hotels lit by electric signs, while just beyond, the Trinity River, neighborhoods like Cement City and West Dallas carried the scars of neglect. Law enforcement in these areas was thin, sometimes corrupt, sometimes indifferent. Children grew up seeing both sides, the proud march of policemen downtown, the quiet acceptance of rule-bending in their own streets. To a child like Clyde, the lesson was clear: authority was not absolute, and justice was not evenly distributed. So, what do you think? When a boy learns that generosity can come from the shadows and that fairness is rarely delivered from the light, what does it do to the architecture of his trust? As the months passed, Clyde began spending more time with older boys. They showed him tricks: how to sneak into orchards without being noticed, how to slip small items into a pocket without drawing eyes, how to run swiftly down side streets when a shopkeeper shouted. None of it felt like crime to him then. It felt like play, like a continuation of the dares and games that filled long summer afternoons. Yet slowly, his world tilted. Each small act carried him further from the narrow safety of home and school, further into the alleys where shadows waited. Bonnie, meanwhile, carried her own small rebellions. She lingered outside movie houses, staring at the posters of silent film stars with eyes lined in kohl, lips painted dark. She practiced their poses. In her mirror, turning her poverty-worn bedroom into a stage. While Clyde learned motion, Bonnie learned performance. Both were rehearsing futures they could not yet name. There's another story. Huff remembered that Clyde once returned home with a pocket knife gifted by one of these older boys. His mother scolded him, asked where he had gotten it. He shrugged, said it was found, said nothing more. But he knew it was not found, it was given. And gifts, he was beginning to learn, carried invisible contracts. Psychologically, these moments mattered more than the fruit, more than the knife, more than the stolen apples. They taught Clyde that the world beyond his family offered a different kind of approval, a different kind of belonging. He was small, often overshadowed by older siblings, but in the alleys he was recognized, encouraged, rewarded. For a boy who craved both autonomy and acknowledgement, this was intoxicating. Many people still think that children are drawn to crime by greed, but more often they are drawn by the allure of recognition, the warmth of belonging, the relief of being seen. Clyde's hunger was not only for food, it was for identity. Bonnie's hunger was not only for escape, it was for meaning. Both found their first tastes of these hungers in places where shadows reached out like strangers offering gifts. The night deepened again. West Dallas settled into its uneven sleep, the alleys empty except for the echo of footsteps. Clyde lay awake, the pear's sweetness still remembered, the knife's weight still imagined. Bonnie, across town, scribbled lines of verse under the flicker of lamplight, her words casting shadows of longing across the page. Neither knew that their small rebellions and first encounters with danger were threads already weaving together, tightening a pattern that would one day pull them both into history's gaze. For now, though, the alley returns to silence. The strangers, hand withdraws, the fruit consumed, the lesson unspoken but etched. Children drift into uneasy dreams, and the night folds itself around them, soft and impenetrable. The dust rises, then settles. The shadows stretch, then fade. Sleep comes, and with it, the quiet certainty that something unseen has begun. School in West Dallas was less a sanctuary than an obligation. Children went because they were told to, because attendants kept truancy officers from knocking at doors, because their parents believed that maybe, just maybe, education could bend fate a little away from poverty's grip. But the classrooms were crowded, the books worn, the air heavy with the smell of chalk and unwashed clothes. Teachers struggled to control the noise, struggled to keep lessons alive in rooms where hunger gnawed louder than a arithmetic dot. Clyde Barrow sat at the back, most days restless, his fingers tapping a rhythm against the desk. He had no patience for the slow cadence of lessons. Words on a page blurred into patterns that seemed less urgent than the sound of passing cars. The rumors whispered in hallways, the daydreams that carried him outside the window. He was clever, sharper than his teachers realized, but his cleverness sought outlets beyond the multiplication tables. He learned to mimic handwriting, to copy signatures, to draw shapes that looked official enough to fool someone not paying attention. It was not study in the traditional sense, but it was learning, and it stayed with him. Bonnie Parker, by contrast, drank in the lessons with an intensity that startled those who knew her. She was quick with language, quick with poetry, and quick with the dramatic cadence of recitation. In a classroom where many voices faltered, hers rang clear. Yet even she felt the pull of the outside world, the sense that time in the schoolroom was stolen, borrowed against a future that did not belong to them. The teachers spoke of progress, of discipline, of shaping character. But what use was character when the streets reminded them each day that power came not from diligence, but from boldness? There is a quiet truth that lingers in such environments. Education is not abandoned all at once. It is abandoned in pieces, traded away for other kinds of lessons. Clyde learned how to read faces instead of textbooks, how to measure silence. In a room, how to tell when someone was watching and when someone was not. Bonnie learned how words could enchant, how rhythm could turn even a poor girl's voice into something commanding. These were not lessons the school intended to teach, but they were lessons that endured longer than geography or grammar. Clyde began to skip more often. Not entire days at first, just hours stolen here and there. He drifted into alleys, into shops, into the company of boys older and bolder. He learned how to sit quiet while others talked, how to let silence cloak him until it was time to move. He learned that the line between daring and danger was thin, and that stepping across it carried a thrill that no classroom could match. To him, those stolen hours were not wasted, they were invested. Each one added to his education in the ways of survival, the ways of power. Bonnie's stolen time was different. She lingered after school at the library, small though it was, running her fingers along the spines of books, choosing volumes that carried her far from the dirt streets. She scribbled lines of poetry in the margins of notebooks, lines that mixed longing with defiance. She watched people downtown, studied the way well-dressed women walked, how they held their heads, how they carried purses and gloves like symbols of belonging. Her stolen hours were rehearsals for a role she had not yet been offered, a part she intended to play. Both children carried home the weight of these divided educations. Their families urged them to stay in school, to hold on to the narrow ladder it offered. But the truth was evident to anyone who looked closely. The ladder was missing rungs, and for children like them, the climb was near impossible. Survival demanded other strategies. There's an image often recalled of Clyde, sitting beneath a tree with a borrowed harmonica, practicing notes until dusk. He never read the sheet music, never studied the theory, but he could catch a tune after hearing it once. That was how he learned, by ear, by instinct, by repetition. Years later, he would approach crime the same way, not through books, not through studied doctrine, but by watching, by imitating, by practicing until the motions became second nature. And there's an image of Bonnie too, walking home with a book tucked under her arm, reciting verses to herself, her lips moving silently, her eyes glowing with the secret fire of words. She understood that language could carve a place for her in memory, even if the world tried to deny her one. She was already rehearsing the lines that would one day turn into poems about guns, love, and death. Psychologically, these parallel paths reveal something essential. Bonnie was shaping a narrative for herself, one where her life would not dissolve into anonymity. Clyde was shaping a set of skills that would let him bend rules before rules bent him. Both were refusing, in their own ways, to accept the script written for children of poverty. They were writing their own scripts, line by line, hour by stolen. Hour. The depression deepened around them. Factories closed, men lined up for work that never came, women stitched clothes from flour sacks. In such a world, the promise of school felt thinner each day. Knowledge did not guarantee survival, boldness did. To stay seated in a classroom while opportunities slipped by outside felt, to Clyde, like surrender. To Bonnie, it felt like postponement. Both grew impatient. One could argue that these stolen hours were the first true crimes, not because they broke the law, but because they stole from the future their families wished for them. They redirected time toward desires unblessed by authority. Every skipped lesson, every scribbled verse, every harmonica tune in the fading light was an act of quiet rebellion. And rebellion, once practiced, rarely dissolves. By the time Clyde reached his teenage years, he already carried himself differently. He knew how to vanish into alleys, how to slip away from questions, how to stand in silence until others underestimated him. By the time Bonnie reached hers, she already carried words like weapons, sharp and ready, hidden but near. Neither had left school entirely, but school had already lost them. They belonged to another curriculum now, one written in shadows and echoes, one that rewarded nerve and punished hesitation. And so the lessons continued outside the chalkboards and textbooks, written instead in stolen time. Lessons of mimicry, of observation, of words as masks and silence as armor. Lessons that would one day converge, binding Bonnie and Clyde not just in love, but in the certainty that the ordinary world had no place for them. The classrooms closed, each evening with the ringing of bells, but their true education did not end with the sound. It carried into the streets, into the alleys, into the fading twilight where dust swirled and shadows waited, while other children laid aside their books. Bonnie and Clyde carried their secret lessons forward, building the foundation of lives that would not bend to the ordinary shape of law and expectation. And so time moved, stolen in fragments, spent in rehearsals and experiments, spent in hunger and defiance. They did not know yet the cost, but they understood the promise to step outside the narrow confines of their world, to seize something larger, even if it meant burning in the attempt. Engines were never just machines in the Texas backroads of the early 1920s. To the poor, they were promises dressed in steel and fire. Boys gathered around the hum of automobiles, the way older generations had gathered around fiddles and church choirs. The engine was not just a tool for moving from one place to another. It was freedom made tangible, a rebellion against the limits of distance and poverty. The hum of pistons could turn silence into possibility. And Clyde Barrow, still lean and restless, felt that hum vibrating through his bones long before he ever touched a steering wheel. He began, as many boys did, by watching older men tinker with cars that rattled down the rutted dirt roads, watching mechanics wipe their hands with rags soaked in grease, watching drivers lean back with the lazy confidence of kings. He could stand for hours near a filling station, absorbing details. The way a spark plug was twisted free, the hiss of gasoline poured into a tank, the subtle pride of a driver who had coaxed a stubborn engine to life. School taught rules and obedience, but the garages and backroads taught something sharper: how to bend the world to your will at first. Clyde was content to hover on the edges, but edges are never enough for a restless boy. Soon he was touching, experimenting, prying open latches that were not his to open. The engines spoke to him, not in words, but in vibrations and rhythms. He learned to recognize the cough of a bad carburetor, the grind of a slipping gear. He understood instinctively that machines had tempers, that they needed patience and boldness at once. In that way, they were not so different from people. The law, meanwhile, lingered at the edges of his education. Constables and deputies prowled, watching for the reckless boys who stole rides, who borrowed without asking, who stripped parts from cars left unattended. To Clyde, they were not enforcers of justice, but obstacles in a game. He began to measure his skill not only by how quickly he could coax an engine awake, but by how quietly he could slip away before a badge caught up with him. Each escape fed a hunger inside him, the hunger for speed, for movement, for the illusion that no chain could bind him. There is a psychology to boys who find themselves seduced by speed. Movement becomes a language, one that drowns out the static of poverty and the monotony of expectation. When the wind lashes your face and the road unspools like ribbon beneath you, the world cannot catch you. For Clyde, that sensation was intoxicating. It was not just joy, was proof that he was more than the dust-choked boy the world saw. Behind the wheel, even if only for stolen minutes, he was untouchable. Bonnie watched all this with a mixture of fascination and caution. She admired his daring, the way he carried himself, with a grin that seemed to taunt the law itself. Yet she understood the danger too. Engines roared not just against silence, but against order. Every spin of the wheels carried risk, every mile, stolen from the law, left another mark against his future. Still, part of her could not look away. It was as though Clyde's restlessness resonated with something in her own chest, the same defiance that made her write poems when others sewed dresses, the same hunger that made her gaze beyond the narrow horizon of West Dallas. Engines also carried symbolism in those years. To respectable families, they meant progress, a chance to leave the dust behind. To the poor, they meant temptation, a chance to borrow power they could not afford. For Clyde, they meant destiny. A car was not merely transportation, it was an accomplice. It could smuggle him away from failure, carry him toward danger, shield him from capture. He understood, instinctively, that machines had tempers, that they needed patience and boldness at once. In that way, they were not so different from people. The law, meanwhile, lingered at the edges of his education. Constables and deputies prowled, watching for the reckless boys who stole rides, who borrowed without asking, who stripped parts from cars left unattended. To Clyde, they were not enforcers of justice, but obstacles in a game. He began to measure his skill not only by how quickly he could coax an engine awake, but by how quietly he could slip away before a badge caught up with him. Each escape fed a hunger inside him, the hunger for speed, for movement, for the illusion that no chain could bind him. There is a psychology to boys who find themselves seduced by speed. Movement becomes a language, one that drowns out the static of poverty and the monotony of expectation. When the wind lashes your face and the road unspools like ribbon beneath you, the world cannot catch you. For Clyde, that sensation was intoxicating. It was not just joy, was proof that he was more than the dust-choked boy the world saw. Behind the wheel, even if only for stolen minutes, he was untouchable. Bonnie watched all this with a mixture of fascination and caution. She admired his daring, the way he carried himself, with a grin that seemed to taunt the law itself. Yet she understood the danger, too. Engines roared not just against silence, but against order. Every spin of the wheels carried risk. Every mile stolen from the law left another mark against his future. Still, part of her could not look away. It was as though Clyde's restlessness resonated with something in her own chest. The same defiance that made her write poems when others sewed dresses. The same hunger that made her gaze beyond the narrow horizon of West Dallas. Engines, also, carried symbolism in those years. Two respectable families, they meant progress, a chance to leave the dust behind. To the poor, they meant temptation, a chance to borrow power they could not afford. For Clyde, they meant destiny. A car was not merely transportation, it was an accomplice. It could smuggle him away from failure, carry him toward danger, shield him from capture. He understood this instinctively, even before he had the skill. To use it fully, one story drifts through the years, difficult to separate from myth. Clyde, no older than 16, is said to have slipped into a car parked outside a roadhouse, fiddled with the ignition until it sputtered alive, and taken it down the back roads while the night air whipped through his hair. He returned it before dawn, careful to leave it where it had been, but the thrill was not in possession, it was in motion. The town whispered about it, though no one could prove it. The boy had stolen not property, but time itself. The law caught glimpses of him. But Clyde was slippery. He learned shortcuts, learned how to duck behind barns, learned the paths where headlights could not reach. These were not just games, they were rehearsals. Rehearsals for a life where speed and silence would become survival itself. He was building a relationship with the automobile that would outlast every classroom, every sermon, every warning his mother could give. Bonnie, meanwhile, was shaping her own lessons in stolen hours, but she could not help being drawn to the poetry of Clyde's obsession. Engines roaring into the night became metaphors for freedom, for defiance, for the possibility of leaving behind the suffocating certainty of poverty. She wrote verses about wind and roads, about escape and shadows. Perhaps she did not yet know. She was writing about him. Perhaps she did. The larger truth is this: when a boy learns engines and learns silence, and when a girl learns words and learns longing, the two together carry the makings of a story that cannot end quietly. The roads were waiting, stretched like veins across Texas. The law was waiting too, patient but unyielding. And Clyde, still a boy in many ways, had already chosen his teacher. The engine was louder than any lecture, faster than any sermon, more honest than any promise. In those early days, when engines roared against quiet law, the shape of the future was already visible. Not in the dust of the classrooms, not in the tired prayers of parents, but in the wild hum of stolen motion. Clyde Barrow was becoming something more than a restless boy. He was becoming a creature of the road, a student of speed, a believer. in the gospel of escape. And Bonnie, watching from her own corner of the world, was preparing to follow. The roads did not care for innocence, and neither did the engines. They demanded nerve, they demanded risk, and they demanded loyalty. Clyde gave all three, and in return they offered him the illusion of freedom. It was an illusion he would chase for the rest of his life. Night carried its own vocabulary in the backroads of Texas, and Clyde spoke it fluently. The air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and dust, and every whisper of wind seemed to carry a warning. Yet in those shadows, promises were made, promises not written in ink but sealed in firelight, beside engines that ticked with cooling metal after long escapes. Bonnie sat close enough to feel the warmth of the machines, and closer still to feel the pull of Clyde's words. His voice, low and certain, painted futures where fences no longer hemmed them in, where the law was always 2 steps too slow, and where their love was boundless and untouchable. These were not reasonable futures, not safe futures, but they were vivid, and in the quiet of the night they felt inevitable. Every gesture became symbolic. A hand brushed against hers, calloused from work and flight, and she felt the weight of a vow unspoken. The headlights of passing cars flickered like ghosts across their faces, reminders that the world outside still moved, still hunted, still judged. Yet in their corner of the night they carved out a sanctuary. Clyde's eyes, sharp and restless, softened only when he looked at her. He confessed without admitting, promised without binding, dreamed without planning. Bonnie listened, her heart caught between fear and devotion, knowing that every word deepened her place in his orbit. There is a dangerous magic in love born out of desperation. It feeds not on stability, but on defiance. Their courtship was not roses and dancers, but the smell of oil on Clyde's clothes, the thrill of narrow escapes, the reckless laughter that followed close calls. To outsiders, it seemed madness. To them, it was truth. Each stolen moment together was proof that they were alive, proof that their connection could eclipse the weight of poverty, the shadow of law, the silence of lonely nights. They did not talk about forever. They talked about tomorrow, and then the next tomorrow, until forever became an unspoken understanding. Firelight flickered against Bonnie's face as she wrote lines of verse on scraps of paper, words stitched together from hunger, love, and the longing to belong somewhere beyond the ordinary. Clyde read them, sometimes smiling, sometimes quiet. He told her that her words gave shape to what he could not say. In return, he gave her the kind of honesty he shared with no one else. His fears of capture, his dreams of speed, his conviction that the world had already chosen him for a path he could not turn from. In those moments, he was not the outlaw in the making, not the restless boy behind the wheel, but simply Clyde, vulnerable and human. The night amplified everything. The stars seemed endless, mocking the smallness of their lives, yet blessing their intimacy. Every howl of a distant dog was a warning, every rustle in the grass a reminder that time was short. Yet instead of pulling them apart, it pulled them closer. Danger was no longer a threat, it was a companion, always seated just beyond the firelight, always listening, always smiling. Bonnie accepted it as part of him, and by doing so, she accepted it as part of herself. Psychologically, these nights were transformative. For Clyde, Bonnie became the one constant in a world that shifted like sand. For Bonnie, Clyde became the embodiment of every poem she had written about escape, every whispered thought she had carried when life felt too small. Together, they forged a bond not just of affection, but of identity. They became each other's reflection, each other's shadow, each other's proof that they could defy the ordinary. The promises whispered beside gasoline fires were not grand or ceremonial. They were simple, to stand together against a world that would not forgive them, to keep moving when the law pressed closer, to choose each other even when it meant choosing ruin. They did not need rings or vows. They needed only the quiet certainty that they belonged to no one but each other. The engines cooled, the fire burned low. The night thickened, but the promises endured. Those who knew them later claimed that this was where the story truly began, not in the violence, not in the headlines, but in these quiet, dangerous nights. For it was here that Bonnie stopped being a girl with dreams and became a partner in destiny. It was here that Clyde's hunger for speed was joined by a hunger for companionship that matched it. And it was here, in the whisper of promises against the backdrop of fire and steel, that two lives sealed themselves to a fate no prayer could undo. The law never heard these promises. The law only saw the aftermath, the dust of their passing, the wreckage left in their wake. But for Bonnie and Clyde, the vows made in shadows were louder than any sermon, stronger than any fear, and truer than any warning. They were already bound not by chains, not by papers, but by the dangerous intimacy of two souls who had decided that if the world would not give them peace, they would take motion instead. Asterisk Anne. Asterisk instinctively that machines had tempers, that they needed patience and boldness at once. In that way, they were not so different from people. The law, meanwhile, lingered at the edges of his education. Constables and deputies prowled, watching. For the reckless boys who stole rides, who borrowed without asking, who stripped parts from cars left unattended. To Clyde, they were not enforcers of justice, but obstacles in a game. He began to measure his skill not only by how quickly he could coax an engine awake, but by how quietly he could slip away before a badge caught up with him. Each escape fed a hunger inside him, the hunger for speed, for movement, for the illusion that no chain could bind him. There is a psychology to boys who find themselves seduced by speed. Movement becomes a language, one that drowns out the static of poverty and the monotony of expectation. When the wind lashes your face and the road unspools like ribbon beneath you, the world cannot catch you. For Clyde, that sensation was intoxicating. It was not just joy, it was proof that he was more than the dust-choked boy the world saw. Behind the wheel, even if only for stolen minutes, he was untouchable. Bonnie watched all this with a mixture of fascination and caution. She admired his daring, the way he carried himself with a grin that seemed to taunt the law itself. Yet she understood the danger too. Engines roared not just against silence, but against order. Every spin of the wheels carried risk. Every mile stolen from the law left another mark against his future. Still, part of her could not look away. It was as though Clyde's restlessness resonated with something in her own chest, the same defiance that made her write poems when others sewed dresses, the same hunger that made her gaze beyond the narrow horizon of West Dallas. Engines also carried symbolism in those years. Two respectable families, they meant progress, a chance to leave the dust behind. To the poor, they meant temptation, a chance to borrow power they could not afford. For Clyde, they meant destiny. A car was not merely transportation, it was an accomplice. It could smuggle him away from failure, carry him toward danger, shield him from capture. He understood this instinctively, even before he had the skill. To use it fully, one story drifts through the years. difficult to separate from myth. Clyde, no older than 16, is said to have slipped into a car parked outside a roadhouse, fiddled with the ignition until it sputtered alive, and taken it down the back roads while the night air whipped through his hair. He returned it before dawn, careful to leave it where it had been, but the thrill was not in possession, it was in motion. The town whispered about it, though no one could prove it. The boy had stolen not property, but time itself. The law caught glimpses of him. But Clyde was slippery. He learned shortcuts, learned how to duck behind barns, learned the paths where headlights could not reach. These were not just games, they were rehearsals. Rehearsals for a life where speed and silence would become survival itself. He was building a relationship with the automobile that would outlast every classroom, every sermon, every warning his mother could give. Bonnie, meanwhile, was shaping her own lessons in stolen hours, but she could not help being drawn to the poetry of Clyde's obsession. Engines roaring into the night became metaphors for freedom, for defiance, for the possibility of leaving behind the suffocating certainty of poverty. She wrote verses about wind and roads, about escape and shadows. Perhaps she did not yet know. She was writing about him. Perhaps she did. The larger truth is this: when a boy learns engines and learns silence, and when a girl learns words and learns longing, the two together carry the makings of a story that cannot end quietly. The roads were waiting, stretched like veins across Texas. The law was waiting too, patient but unyielding. And Clyde, still a boy in many ways, had already chosen his teacher. The engine was louder than any lecture, faster than any sermon, more honest than any promise. In those early days, when engines roared against quiet law, the shape of the future was already visible. Not in the dust of the classrooms, not in the tired prayers of parents, but in the wild hum of stolen motion. Clyde Barrow was becoming something more than a restless boy. He was becoming a creature of the road, a student of speed, a believer in the gospel of escape. And Bonnie, watching from her own corner of the world, was preparing to follow. The roads did not care for innocence, and neither did the engines. They demanded nerve, they demanded risk, and they demanded loyalty. Clyde gave all three, and in return, they offered him the illusion of freedom. It was an illusion he would chase for the rest of his life. Night carried its own vocabulary in the back roads of Texas, and Clyde spoke it fluently. The air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and dust, and every whisper of wind seemed to carry a warning. Yet in those shadows, promises were made. Promises not written in ink, but sealed in firelight, beside engines that ticked with cooling metal after long escapes. Bonnie sat close enough to feel the warmth of the machines, and closer still to feel the pull of Clyde's words. His voice, low and certain, painted futures where fences no longer hemmed them in, where the law was always 2 steps too slow, and where their love was boundless and untouchable. These were not reasonable futures, not safe futures, but they were vivid, and in the quiet of the night they felt inevitable. Every gesture became symbolic. A hand brushed against hers, calloused from work and flight, and she felt the weight of a vow unspoken. The headlights of passing cars flickered like ghosts across their faces, reminders that the world outside still moved, still hunted, still judged, yet in their corner of the night they carved out a sanctuary. Clyde's eyes, sharp and restless, softened only when he looked at her. He confessed without admitting, promised without binding, dreamed without planning. Bonnie listened, her heart caught between fear and devotion. knowing that every word deepened her place in his orbit. There is a dangerous magic in love born out of desperation. It feeds not on stability, but on defiance. Their courtship was not roses and dancers, but the smell of oil on Clyde's clothes, the thrill of narrow escapes, the reckless laughter that followed close calls. To outsiders, it seemed madness. To them, it was truth. Each stolen moment together was proof that they were alive, proof that their connection could eclipse the weight of poverty, the shadow of law, the silence of lonely nights. They did not talk about forever. They talked about tomorrow, and then the next tomorrow, until forever became an unspoken understanding. Firelight flickered against Bonnie's face as she wrote lines of verse on scraps of paper, words stitched together from hunger, love, and the longing to belong somewhere beyond the ordinary. Clyde read them, sometimes smiling, sometimes quiet. He told her that her words gave shape to what he could not say. In return, he gave her the kind of honesty he shared with no one else, his fears of capture, his dreams of speed, his conviction that the world had already chosen him for a path he could not turn from. In those moments, he was not the outlaw in the making, not the restless boy behind the wheel, but simply Clyde, vulnerable and human. The night amplified everything. The stars seemed endless, mocking the smallness of their lives, yet blessing their intimacy. Every howl of a distant dog was a warning, every rustle in the grass a reminder that time was short. Yet instead of pulling them apart, it pulled them closer. Danger was no longer a threat, it was a companion, always seated just beyond the firelight, always listening, always smiling. Bonnie accepted it as part of him, and by doing so, she accepted it as part of herself. Psychologically, these nights were transformative. For Clyde, Bonnie became the one constant in a world that shifted like sand. For Bonnie, Clyde became the embodiment of every poem she had written about escape, every whispered thought she had carried when life felt too small. Together, they forged a bond not just of affection, but of identity. They became each other's reflection, each other's shadow, each other's proof that they could defy the ordinary. The promises whispered beside gasoline fires were not grand or ceremonial. They were simple, to stand together against a world that would not forgive them, to keep moving when the law pressed closer, to choose each other even when it meant choosing ruin. They did not need rings or vows. They needed only the quiet certainty that they belonged to no one but each other. The engines cooled, the fire burned low. The night thickened, but the promises endured. Those who knew them later claimed that this was where the story truly began, not in the violence, not in the headlines, but in these quiet, dangerous nights. For it was here that Bonnie stopped being a girl with dreams and became a partner in destiny. It was here that Clyde's hunger for speed was joined by a hunger for companionship that matched it. And it was here, in the whisper of promises against the backdrop of fire and steel, that two lives sealed themselves to a fate no prayer could undo. The law never heard these promises. The law only saw the aftermath, the dust of their passing, the wreckage left in their wake. But for Bonnie and Clyde, the vows made in shadows were louder than any sermon, stronger than any fear, and truer than any warning. They were already bound not by chains, not by papers, but by the dangerous intimacy of two souls who had decided that if the world would not give them peace, they would take motion instead. Anne. The night ended as it always did, with silence. Engines cooling into quiet, fire burning into ash, words dissolving into unspoken understanding. Yet the silence was not empty, it was heavy with promise. And in that silence, the world tilted, setting them on a path where love and ruin would walk hand in hand, and where every mile ahead would be written in fire, steel, and shadows. The landscape seemed to bend itself around the Barrow gang as their ambitions grew. Roads no longer felt like passages, but veins of a body they were learning to control, pulsing with danger and opportunity. Clyde drove with a steady hand, eyes narrowed against the endless horizon. Bonnie beside him, with her notebook half filled with poems and half with plans. Their crew, bound by loyalty more fragile than it seemed, leaned on one another with the quiet understanding that survival required unity. Each town they passed through was both stage and hiding place, every backroad a thread in a tapestry of desperation stitched together by need, hunger, and a constant reaching for more. The dust that clung to their clothes seemed less like dirt now and more like a crown, marking them as rulers of a shadowy kingdom that existed only between dusk and dawn. Expansion was not something they announced. It was something that simply happened. One job blurred into another, each larger than the last, each leaving behind more whispers. The countryside felt smaller with every mile, yet their names travelled farther than they did. Clyde, once the restless boy with a stolen car, now stood as a figure people recognized even in silence. He carried himself with an authority born not from training but from necessity, and Bonnie's presence gave his legend a sharpness that others could not match. Together they radiated a reckless charisma, and others followed, not because they trusted entirely, but because standing near their fire was warmer than facing the cold world alone. In moments of quiet, the growth was most visible. The gang no longer scattered after each run. They regrouped, shared meals, passed bottles, told stories that always edged toward myth. Bonnie watched the way Clyde listened to them, the way he gave small nods of approval, the way he reinforced bonds with little gestures that seemed insignificant but were calculated. He was building something larger than himself, even if he never admitted it aloud. She knew he felt it, that the sense that their reach was stretching, that their little world of stolen nights and desperate escapes had grown into a pattern, a rhythm too strong to be coincidence. But expansion also carried weight. With each new venture came the burden of expectation, the demand to outdo the last. Clyde felt it in his bones. Sleep grew shallow. Paranoia lingered in his eyes. He talked less about dreams and more about logistics, more about routes and watches and which towns to avoid. Bonnie sensed the shift, the way his focus sharpened like steel under pressure, the way his restlessness became less about escape and more about domination. He was no longer simply running from poverty or confinement. He was beginning to believe in his own legend, and legends cannot stand still. For Bonnie, there was a quiet conflict brewing beneath her devotion. She loved him more fiercely than ever, but she also felt the tremors of inevitability. The growth of their world meant the shrinking of their options. The roads were becoming narrower, the silences heavier, the danger closer. And yet she chose him again and again, even as she wrote verses about ashes, about fleeting stars, about the fragility of love caught in the jaws of fate. Her pen carved out truths she never spoke, but Clyde read them in her eyes, and in that unspoken exchange they both understood. The cost of expansion was not measured only in risk, but in time slipping quietly away. The crew saw Clyde as steady, decisive, almost untouchable, but Bonnie knew the shadows beneath his certainty. She saw the twitch of his fingers when headlights appeared in the distance, the way his jaw tightened when silence stretched too long. He was not invincible, he was human, pulled taut by the weight of being more than a man. Yet he bore it, because there was no turning back, no shrinking of a kingdom once it had begun to grow. Power was a tide, and Clyde let it carry him, even as he feared where it might break. Nights grew longer, and whispers louder. Townsfolk who once shrugged at the idea of petty outlaws now spoke their names with caution, with curiosity, with a mix of admiration and dread. Stories multiplied, some true, some bent into myth, and the myths worked in their favor, magnifying their reach beyond the reality of their actions. Territory was not marked with fences or maps, but with stories told. In diners, on porches, in the breathless retellings of those who claimed they had seen the couple themselves. Expansion had become less about roads traveled and more about imaginations captured. Still, the nights always returned to the same quiet core. After the laughter, after the boasts, after the thrill, it was just Bonnie and Clyde, sitting in the silence, the air heavy with both triumph and foreboding. She leaned against him, felt the rhythm of his breath, and wondered how long it could last. He kissed her temple, whispered nothing at all, and stared out into the darkness. Neither needed to say what both already knew. Growth meant exposure, exposure meant danger, and danger meant that every mile forward might be their last. Yet still they drove on, because to stop was to surrender. And surrender had never been an option. Expansion was not a choice, but a current, pulling them deeper into the mythology they had begun to weave. Each job, each whisper, each night of reckless laughter strengthened the fabric of their legend. But legends come with costs, and beneath the triumphs, the ground already trembled with the weight of debts yet to be paid. The road stretched on, unending, unrelenting, a ribbon of possibility, and ruin braided together. And as Clyde pressed the car forward, and Bonnie wrote verses that blurred the line between prophecy and poetry, the kingdom of dust and fire they had built expanded 1 mile at a time, fragile, fleeting, and unstoppable. The height of their world did not come with a single moment of triumph, but rather with a slow accumulation of days, where the air itself seemed to bow in their presence. They had become figures larger than the countryside they roamed, their silhouettes recognizable in whispers long before they arrived. Every town carried rumors of their passing, of the cars that sped through the night with headlights dimmed, of the couple who lived as if time itself could not touch them. Power was not declared. It seeped into the soil, into the way people looked over their shoulders, into the way their names floated through smoke-filled rooms like fragments of a prayer and a warning entwined. Bonnie and Clyde had reached a point where survival had turned into dominion. Their crew followed not only out of necessity, but because they believed proximity to the pair meant touching immortality. Each heist, each escape, each reckless gamble fed the aura that surrounded them. To outsiders, they were a story already, hardened into legend. To those inside the circle, they were leaders who carried themselves with a calm so deliberate it resembled fate itself. Bonnie, with her poetry and her steady gaze, and Clyde, with his cold certainty behind the wheel, projected an image of inevitability that made others forget just how fragile the line between control and collapse could be. The roads no longer seemed endless. They seemed conquered. Every mile they drove felt like territory claimed, not with ink or borders, but with the rhythm of tires against dirt and asphalt. Clyde's hand rested easy on the wheel, but his mind was always awake, calculating, shaping. Decisions that kept the empire invisible yet undeniable. Bonnie fed the myth, her words scribbled in verses that painted their lives not as desperation but as destiny. In her poems they were not fugitives, they were lovers defying the ordinary, figures bound to flame rather than chains. Her words outlived each job, each night of fleeing, echoing louder than the clamour of lawmen chasing their shadows. The gang thrived under this aura of inevitability. Meals shared in barns and fields carried the air of feasts, laughter rolling across the night as though they had conquered kingdoms rather than stolen fleeting riches. Bonds grew, rituals formed, a bottle passed hand to hand, a song hummed softly in the dark, a cigarette glowing like a beacon in the stillness. They became more than thieves. They became a community, a strange family welded together by circumstance and fear but bound by a shared belief that they were part of something greater. Bonnie saw it in their eyes, the way they looked to Clyde for approval, the way they leaned toward her stories, as though her words could make their existence eternal. Yet in the quietest hours, beneath the veneer of triumph, the weight of their empire pressed against them. Clyde felt it first, in the tightening of his chest when headlights flashed unexpectedly, in the dull ache of knowing that every victory demanded a greater one to follow. He had built a machine that consumed rest and demanded motion, a rhythm that left no room for stillness. Power did not soothe him, it sharpened his edges. He moved like a man convinced that stillness would kill him, that silence would reveal cracks in the myth he had constructed. Bonnie watched him and saw not only the man she loved, but the shadow he was becoming, an echo of himself stretched thin by the demand to live larger than life. For Bonnie, the height of their empire was bittersweet. She felt the intoxication of the myth, the thrill of knowing they had bent the world around them, but she also sensed the ticking of an invisible clock. Her verses grew darker, threaded, with imagery of falling stars, of ash settling where flames once raged, of lovers running so fast they blurred into ghosts. She wrote of their triumphs, yes, but also of the cost of such brightness, the inevitable dimming that followed. She shared only fragments aloud, but Clyde read them in her silence, in the way she lingered on the horizon when the car stopped, in the way her eyes clouded when laughter faded into quiet. Their height was also their exposure. The more powerful they became, the more visible they were. Their names carried farther than their car could travel, their faces etched into the minds of strangers who would never forget the glimpse of them. Stories painted them as invincible, but invincibility is only convincing until the moment it breaks. Still, they leaned into it, embraced it, allowed the myth to shield them from fear. Power was a mask, and they wore it even when it grew heavy, even when the mask cut into their skin. Nights at the height of their reign carried a strange stillness, as though the air itself was holding its breath. They camped in fields where the grass whispered of secrets. They watched the stars with a silence that seemed to stretch longer than the night. Their laughter was softer, their touches heavier, as though each moment carried more weight than the last. Clyde smoked in silence, his thoughts locked away, while Bonnie wrote in the dim glow, her pen carving futures she dared not speak. Together they sat, not as king and queen of some criminal empire, but as two souls holding tightly to one another against the immensity of a world closing in. Their peak was not a celebration, but a plateau, a place where time seemed to pause and stretch, offering them the illusion of permanence. Yet both knew permanence was a lie. Power built on whispers and shadows cannot last forever. The height was beautiful in its fragility, intoxicating in its fleeting brilliance. And as Bonnie tucked her poems into her bag, and Clyde pressed the accelerator once more into the dark. They both felt it, the knowledge that the higher they climbed, the thinner the air became, and the closer the edge loomed, and so their empire lived in the spaces between roads and silences, between laughter and fear, between myth and reality. It was vast, untouchable, and yet as fragile as glass in a storm. They held it as long as they could, knowing it would one day shatter, but for now, in that moment of fragile triumph, they allowed themselves to believe they had touched something. Eternal trust for them was never simple. At first it had been the glue that held the gang together, the unspoken bond that turned a scattered group of restless souls into something resembling a family. But as the months stretched on and the nights grew colder, shadows began to creep into the spaces between laughter. Clyde noticed it in the small gestures, the way eyes lingered too long on the money, the way footsteps hesitated before following his orders, the way silence filled the air where once there had been careless chatter. Power had given them dominance, but it had also carved cracks into their foundation, cracks that widened with every mile they drove. Bonnie felt it too. She had always been the softer presence, the one who could calm tempers with a glance or stitch wounds with her words. But now she saw how exhaustion changed men. Trust frayed easily when fear of capture haunted every road. She wrote in her notebook, verses that spoke of mirrors with cracks running through them, of voices carried away by the wind, of loyalty slipping like water through cupped hands. She never read these aloud, but Clyde sensed them in her quiet, in the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Her eyes held both faith and worry, as though she trusted him completely yet feared what trust itself was becoming. The gang began to splinter under the weight of suspicion. Long nights in barns turned tense, the silence broken by arguments over small things, who stood watch too long, who ate more than their share, who carried the most risk when jobs went wrong. Clyde tried to steady the crew with his calm commands, his sharp glances that reminded them he was always in control. Yet even he could not silence the doubts growing in his own mind. Every smile looked too forced, every promise too polished. He began to test them, leaving trails of half-truths, watching who repeated them, who asked too many questions. Paranoia became a companion, whispering into Clyde's ear when the night was too still. He drove faster, rested less, his eyes darting constantly to the mirrors, not just for the law, but for betrayal from within. Bonnie noticed the toll. His jaw stayed clenched, even in sleep. His hands trembled slightly when he lit a cigarette, and sometimes his voice snapped sharper than he intended. She tried to soothe him, but even her words seemed unable to soften the grip of mistrust. Yet it was not only Clyde. The others felt it too. The weight of being hunted changed men, making them sharper, more restless, less willing to share the burden equally. Some began to dream of escape, not the kind Bonnie and Clyde clung to, with romance and fire at its core, but quieter escapes, a deal struck in secret, a confession whispered to the right ear, freedom bought at the price of loyalty. The possibility of betrayal hung in the air like smoke, impossible to see clearly yet impossible to ignore. Bonnie wrote of it in darker tones. Her verses carried images of knives hidden behind smiles, of doors left open in the night, of footsteps fading away while others still slept. She confessed silently to the page that even love itself could not entirely banish fear. She trusted Clyde, but she saw what suspicion was doing to him, how it isolated him, how it made him more machine than man. She feared not only the betrayal of others but the transformation of the one she loved most. The gang's laughter grew thinner. Conversations stopped short when Clyde entered the room. Even meals carried tension, bites taken in silence, glances traded like weapons. The myth of invincibility remained on the outside, but within, the air had turned heavy. Every man began to wonder if the others had already planned a way out, and that thought poisoned whatever bonds remained. Clyde tried to remind them of their victories, their legend, but even legends could not erase the feeling that the walls were closing in. Trust, once their strength, now became their weakness. Each decision felt heavier, each silence louder, each night longer. Clyde tightened his grip, pushing the gang harder, refusing to show weakness, yet the very act of control deepened the rift. Bonnie, writing by candlelight, captured the truth he could not admit, that trust, once broken, is never whole again in the stillness of night. As tires hummed against endless roads and stars blurred through the windshield, the two lovers sat side by side. Their hands brushed, their silence spoke volumes. They still trusted each other, and perhaps that was all they had left. But in the echoes behind them, in the restless shuffling of their crew, in the shadows that seemed to grow longer with each, dawn, the cost of mistrust, waited, patient and inevitable. They carried it like an invisible weight, knowing it would shape not only their journey, but their very end. By the time their legend reached its loudest echo, their world had become a strange mixture of freedom and confinement. The roads stretched endlessly before them, yet every town blurred into the same nervous-shaped streets that turned quiet when their names were whispered. Windows that drew curtains when headlights passed. They had carved a territory not with flags or maps, but with fear, myth, and the sound of engines tearing through the night. It was not land in the usual sense, but influence, an invisible net of reputation that stretched across state lines and into the minds of anyone who might cross their path. Clyde understood the mechanics of this reach. He knew which highways offered quick escapes, which back roads curled into cover, which counties could be crossed without notice. It was not about owning streets. It was about owning the idea of escape itself. People whispered about them in diners. Lawmen studied their habits with furrowed brows. Yet still they moved, weaving in and out of places as though the world itself bent for them. This was their empire, not of bricks or buildings, but of motion. And memory, Bonnie, meanwhile, gave it shape in words. Her notebook carried verses that turned their lives into something larger than survival. She wrote of horizons always just out of reach, of nights that hummed with fire, of two souls bound together by the inevitability of their road. Her words circulated quietly, passed in fragments, adding to the myth even as the real Bonnie sat, cramped in the back seat, her body tired, her lungs aching from the dust of backcountry roads. She was both architect of legend and victim of its weight. Their enterprises became less about money and more about the act of defiance itself. Small banks shuttered early, stores locked their doors when strangers appeared, and rumors of their presence emptied entire highways. The material gain was fleeting, but the psychological hold lingered. They lived not in the coins they carried, but in the silence that followed their arrival. Even the lawmen admitted, in moments of private frustration, that chasing them had become chasing a symbol. But symbols could not hide the cost. Each town left behind carried fragments of violence and echoes of gunfire. Each hurried escape planted seeds of weariness in the gang. The territory they controlled was a phantom one, stitched together by myth and fear, but within it, exhaustion gnawed at them. Long days bled into longer nights, food grew scarce, trust grew thin, And yet the legend only swelled, feeding on every headline, every hurried radio report. Clyde took to studying maps late at night, his eyes tracing lines across state borders, his fingers tapping at roots as if rhythm alone could ensure survival. He no longer looked only for opportunity, but for patterns where the law gathered, where the whispers thickened, where the next noose might tighten. The empire they held in shadows was fragile, and he knew it. Still, he pressed forward, for to stop would mean surrender, and surrender was never an option. Bonnie's health began to falter in those years. Injuries lingered, the strain of endless travel wore her down, and yet she clung to Clyde with a devotion that startled even their closest companions. Her words grew darker, more fatalistic. She wrote not only of horizons, but of endings, of roads that curved toward inevitable silence, of fire that could not burn forever. She seemed to sense what Clyde refused to admit, that every empire of shadows collapses. No matter how wide it stretches, the world around them shifted as well. Newspapers transformed them into figures larger than life, equal parts villains and tragic lovers. Children whispered their names with awe. Parents warned against becoming like them. Lawmen sharpened their resolve. The myth had grown beyond their control, painting them as more organized, more invincible than they truly were. The truth was exhaustion, paranoia, hunger, and a body that ached for rest. But the myth demanded performance, and so they played their parts until the curtain threatened to fall. The gang followed Clyde still, though less with devotion than with necessity. They lived under the shadow of his control, yet even they could not ignore the cracks forming in their empire. Disputes turned bitter, patience thinned, and every man knew the net was tightening. Territory, once an illusion of freedom, now felt like a shrinking cage. The places that once welcomed their escape became traps waiting to spring shut. In quiet moments, Bonnie and Clyde sat together and spoke of other lives they might have lived: small houses, children, mornings without fear. But such words drifted into silence, overtaken by the reality of their path. The empire of shadows they had built could not be abandoned, for it was the only world left to them. They had become prisoners of the very myth that once gave them freedom, and so they pressed forward, deeper into the labyrinth of roads and whispers, clinging to the fragile illusion of control. The territory was theirs in name, but already it trembled. Already it betrayed the truth that no shadow stretches forever, and no legend escapes the weight of its own making. The first cracks appeared, not in the roar of gunfire, but in the quiet persistence of men who refused to let their names fade from the papers. Law enforcement, once scattered and uncoordinated, began to gather threads together with a patience that mirrored the way rivers carve stone. In the beginning, their chases had been frantic local sheriffs and deputies lunging across county lines, only to lose the trail when the car disappeared into dust. But time had shifted the balance. Patterns emerged where before there was chaos. Files grew thick with notes, maps lined with pins, photographs copied and passed across state lines. The myth of invincibility had stirred not only fear but determination. Clyde had always counted on speed to protect them. The Ford V8 was their lifeline, its engine carrying them out of reach faster than men with slower cars could follow. But now, the same government that had once dismissed them as drifters had begun supplying lawmen with better machines, sharper eyes, and coordination that stretched beyond the borders Clyde trusted so deeply. The radio carried voices farther than wheels could travel, and those voices began to weave a net. No longer was it only one county chasing them, it was states. And soon it was the nation itself. Bonnie felt the shift in quieter ways. She noticed the faces that lingered too long in cafes, the way travelers on lonely roads carried weapons in plain sight, the way even sympathetic strangers carried a fear that made kindness brittle. She had always lived with danger, but now the world itself seemed to lean against them. The newspapers that once celebrated their daring began to sharpen their edges, branding them less as lovers on the run and more as predators whose days were numbered. Public fascination remained, but admiration withered. What grew in its place was a hunger for justice. The pressure came not only from the law, but from hunger, fatigue, and the shrinking circle of safety. Safe houses closed one by one. Farmers who had once offered food grew wary. Relatives whispered about visits that could no longer be risked. The circle of trust contracted until only a few remained, and even those bonds carried the weight of doubt. For Clyde, the road became narrower, every mile marked with the possibility of ambush. For Bonnie, each day bled into the next, with the knowledge that the shadow looming behind them was no longer distant, it was near, and it was learning. Investigators studied their movements with clinical care. They noted the rhythm of robberies, the pattern of counties chosen, the strange loyalty Clyde had to familiar backroads. They understood that myth could be turned against myth. If the pair thrived on unpredictability, then patience would undo them. The law did not need to win in a single chase, it needed only to wait for the inevitable mistake. The moment when the hunted forgot that every road has an ending. Clyde grew restless under this invisible pressure. He drove longer, slept less, studied maps with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He trusted fewer people, spoke less to his companions, and let suspicion cloud even moments of closeness. To Bonnie, he seemed stretched thin, every nerve wired tight, his mind no longer filled with dreams of escape, but with calculations of survival. The laughter that had once filled the car in fleeting bursts became rare. Silence settled in, heavy and suffocating. Bonnie's poetry shifted too. Gone were the romantic verses of endless roads and burning skies. In their place appeared darker lines, sketches of watchers in the night, of engines that failed at the worst moment, of skies that bent low with the weight of endings. She seemed to sense, more than Clyde, that the law was not merely chasing them, was surrounding them, suffocating them, writing their final chapter before they had a chance to shape it themselves. Her verses read like premonitions, though. Clyde waved them away with a bitterness that hid his own unspoken fear. The roads they once claimed with confidence became treacherous. Towns they had breezed through now held deputies with rifles. Highways that promised speed ended in checkpoints. Every face in a diner could be the one to call in a sighting. The freedom they had carved out of motion shrank into a maze. Each turn met with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was watching. The law did not sleep, and its patience was endless. Inside their small circle, whispers grew. Associates grew cautious, questioning the wisdom of staying tied to names that carried both myth and doom. Some drifted away, others betrayed secrets in exchange for leniency, and still others lingered only because escape was impossible. The weight of loyalty was tested against the weight of survival, and survival began to win. Clyde noticed the hesitations, the glances that lingered too long, the silence that followed when his back was turned. The law did not need to break the gang from without. It needed only to wait for fractures within. The pressure became most visible in the small moments. Clyde checking his mirrors too often, Bonnie holding her breath each time headlights appeared in the distance. The gang members, sleeping with weapons clutched to their chests. Meals were eaten in haste, laughter stifled before it could rise. The shadow of pursuit had become more than a threat, it was a constant companion, as present as the rumble of the engine or the dust on the horizon. And yet, despite the fear, they pressed forward, for what else was left? To stop was to surrender, and surrender was death in another form. They chose the only path they had ever known, forward, faster, deeper into the roads that had carried them this far. But the difference was clear. The law had learned, adapted, and hardened. The hunters no longer stumbled. They waited with patience sharpened by time, knowing the day would come when the lovers who had once defied them would drive into the trap they had been building all along. The first signs of pressure had become a weight, pressing down on every decision, every mile, every breath. Bonnie and Clyde had built a life on speed and surprise, but now the world had caught its rhythm, and in that rhythm, in the steady tightening of the net, lay the beginning of the end. Trust had always been the fragile thread holding their world together, and now it began to fray. In the beginning, loyalty had seemed unshakable, bound by shared hunger, shared danger, and the intoxicating glamour of standing against the world. But time changes the weight of promises. Fear grows heavier than devotion, and survival whispers louder than love or oath. The betrayals did not come all at once. They crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks, impossible to notice until the foundation itself began to shift beneath their feet. Associates who had once laughed at the danger began to speak in hushed tones about the rising pressure from the law. The walls of every jail cell carried rumors, and the names Bonnie and Clyde echoed like curses that brought longer sentences and harsher judgments. Men who had once claimed brotherhood began to wonder if silence was worth the price of their own lives. A deputy's offer of leniency could weigh heavier than loyalty when the gallows loomed in the mind. It was not hatred that made men turn, but fear, the cold calculation that a life could be spared if another's path was handed over. Family, too, became a risk. Clyde had always returned to the warmth of home when he could, slipping into the familiarity of his mother's voice, the steady comfort of shared meals and old stories. But the visits, once grounding, became dangerous. Lawmen had learned his pattern, circling the family farm like wolves, waiting for the inevitable return of the son who could not cut himself free. Each embrace carried the shadow of eyes watching. From the distance, each whispered conversation a chance for the law to tighten its noose. Mothers and siblings found themselves torn between blood and survival, between love for the outlaw and fear of the men who demanded cooperation. Bonnie sensed the change as much as Clyde. She saw it in the hesitation of relatives when the knock came too late at night, in the nervous glances exchanged when questions lingered too long. She felt it in the way neighbors spoke, like admirers of legend, more like people guarding their own safety by keeping their distance. The myth had made them untouchable in the eyes of strangers for a time, but myths fade when weighed against the hard stare of a deputy demanding answers. Silence became more dangerous than speech, and fear loosened tongues once sealed by loyalty. It was the small betrayals that cut deepest. A cousin who let slip a visit, a friend who revealed a route, an old partner who chose to save himself by pointing a finger. None admitted outright betrayal. Each told themselves it was survival, that no single word would endanger anyone, that the law already knew what they confessed. But each detail carried weight, Each whisper filled the files of the men who hunted, each confession turning the wide-open world into a narrow corridor with fewer exits each day. Clyde grew harder with every sign of weakness around him. He spoke less, trusted almost no one, and let anger replace the warmth that once bound his circle together. The betrayals confirmed what he had always feared, that loyalty was an illusion, that when the law pressed hard enough, even blood could be coaxed into treachery. He tightened his grip on Bonnie, his one constant, yet even she felt the strain of his suspicion pressing against them both. Love endured, but it carried scars. The law understood the power of betrayal better than bullets. They leaned on families, interrogated friends, dangled promises of freedom before weary men who had shared rides and robberies. They built their net not only with roadblocks and rifles, but with whispered offers in dimly lit rooms. Survival became a currency, and information its most valuable coin. The circle that had once protected the outlaws became riddled with cracks, each one a line through which the hunters pressed. The road became lonelier. Companions peeled away, some out of fear, some out of guilt, others out of quiet betrayal that left Bonnie and Clyde exposed. The laughter of shared fires and stolen meals dwindled, replaced by long silences broken only by the sound of an engine pushing forward. Bonnie clung to Clyde not only out of love, but because she saw that he trusted no one else. She wrote of faith and ruin, of a world where even family could turn into informants, where blood ties snapped under the weight of law. Her verses read like warnings and elegies both, capturing the slow unraveling of trust that left them stranded. In a hostile world, each betrayal carried consequences. Safe houses that had once welcomed them now closed their doors. Familiar roads became traps. A meeting place whispered in confidence became the site of waiting rifles. Every mistake seemed less like chance and more like deliberate guidance, as though unseen hands were feeding their movements to the law. Clyde noticed, raged, struck out with violence against those he suspected, but the damage was already done. Once betrayal had entered their circle, it could not be purged. It multiplied, unseen and unstoppable, until every ally was a potential traitor. The betrayals did more than narrow their escape. They eroded the myth itself. Newspapers that once painted them as daring outlaws now wrote of those they left behind, of families dragged into the mud, of accomplices rotting in cells while Bonnie and Clyde remained free. Sympathy withered in the public eye. What remained was a sense that the pair carried destruction not only in their guns, but in their very presence. To shelter them was to risk ruin, and few were willing to pay that price when survival demanded distance. The lovers pressed on, bound tighter too, each other as the circle collapsed. Bonnie's devotion hardened in the face of isolation, her presence both bomb and chain for Clyde's restless spirit. Together they carried the weight of betrayal, though it left them lonelier, harsher, and more desperate. The roads were the only companions that did not turn against them, and even those roads were growing shorter, leading them closer to the end, waiting with patient certainty. Betrayal was not a sudden storm, but a steady erosion, a quiet crumbling of the world they had built on trust. Associates, friends, even family, in their own way loosened their grip, leaving Bonnie and Clyde suspended above the abyss with only each other to hold on to. The law had no need for a dramatic capture yet. It could wait. The outlaws were being undone from within, piece by piece, betrayal by betrayal, until there would be nowhere left to run. The courtroom became another kind of stage, though one less. Forgiving than the roads and fields where their legend had been written. Here, the audience did not cheer, it judged. The walls smelled of dust, sweat, and old paper, and the silence that hung over the benches was heavier than any rifle raised in ambush. Legal proceedings did not move with the speed of bullets or the chaos of a chase. They moved with the grinding patience of men who had learned that time itself could be a weapon. Trials, when they came, were less about justice than about spectacle. The newspapers had already cast their verdict long before the gavel struck wood. Headlines screamed of depravity, of daring escapes, of crimes committed with cold certainty. Photographers waited outside the courthouse to capture every glance, every twitch, every step taken by those connected to Bonnie and Clyde, even if the outlaws themselves were not dragged into the courtroom. Their shadows filled the space. Every accomplice, every suspected sympathizer carried the weight of their myth, standing trial not only for themselves, but for the legends they had brushed against. The judges knew the weight of public opinion and did not wish to appear weak before it. Harsh sentences were handed down, often more severe than the crimes alone demanded, because to show leniency was to risk appearing complicit in the eyes of an angry public. The law, stung by the mockery of daring robberies and the humiliation of repeated escapes, sought vengeance disguised as order. It was not only about punishing those guilty of deeds, but about restoring the wounded pride of institutions that had been made to look powerless. The defense, in such cases, spoke against an overwhelming tide. Lawyers argued for circumstance, for poverty, for the desperation that had driven young men and women to join Clyde's reckless path. They spoke of families left with nothing, of dreams starved by the depression, of lives already condemned long before a gun was ever lifted. Yet their words struggled to find purchase against the roaring appetite of a public that wanted villains more than explanations. The jury did not want to hear of hunger or desperation. It wanted blood, or at least the closest substitute available. In chains and iron bars, spectacle shaped the trials as much as evidence. Courtrooms overflowed with spectators, not only locals, but those who travelled miles to watch the drama unfold. They craned their necks for a glimpse of a wife weeping for her husband, for the trembling hand of a young man swearing he knew nothing, for the weary eyes of mothers called to testify about sons who had vanished into Clyde's shadow. The proceedings became theatre, with each player forced into roles scripted by rumour and headline long before the trial itself. Those accused often looked out over the crowded benches and understood that no argument could shift the tide. They had been condemned in ink before they were condemned in law. Their fates were sealed less by the evidence than by the need to make examples. Each sentence handed down was meant to echo outward, a warning to anyone who considered offering shelter or sympathy to the Barrow gang. In truth, the trials served as weapons of deterrence as much as instruments of justice. Bonnie and Clyde followed the reports with a mixture of anger and inevitability. They read of friends given decades behind bars, of family members dragged into questioning, of whispers twisted into damning testimony. Bonnie's poetry recorded the bitterness she felt at seeing those they loved paraded like criminals for the crime of proximity. Clyde's silence carried the weight of guilt and rage. Each trial reminded them that their freedom was not only their own, but bought at the expense of those who had stood too close. The law's response hardened with each passing month. What began as local cases soon spread to federal interest. The crimes no longer seen as scattered robberies, but as insults to authority itself. Courtrooms became louder, the sentences heavier, and the reach of lawmen stretched further. It was not enough to chase Bonnie and Clyde across state lines. The courts sought to dismantle the network that made escape possible. To house them, to feed them, to speak in their defense became risks punishable by the heavy hand of the state. The sensationalism of the trials fed into the cycle of myth. Papers printed every detail, often bending truth to heighten drama. A minor theft was magnified into proof of a sprawling empire of crime. A nervous stumble in testimony became evidence of guilt. Mothers who pleaded for mercy were painted as manipulative, lovers as dangerous seductresses, children as future criminals. The law provided the stage, the press provided the script, and the audience devoured the story with hunger sharpened by years of deprivation and fear. In this theater, truth mattered less than the roles assigned. The lawmen became righteous heroes. In crisp uniforms, the accused became villains in desperate rags, and the judges became the stern arbiters who restored order to a society shaken by chaos. Whether the accused had fired a gun or merely shared a meal, they were folded into the same narrative. Condemned by association with the names Bonnie and Clyde, the myth, once a shield, had turned into a weapon against those who bore it unwillingly. For Bonnie and Clyde, the trials were warnings carved into stone. They understood that the world was tightening around them, not only with bullets, but with words, with judgments handed down in echoing chambers they never stepped into. They were becoming more than outlaws. They were becoming symbols against which society measured its fear, its outrage, its hunger for control. The courtrooms, far from the dust and fire of their escapes, shaped their fates as much as any ambush, and in those rooms, filled with the scratching of pens and the murmurs of spectators, the end of their story was already being written. It would not matter whether the verdicts were fair or not. What mattered was that the law had decided they would not be allowed to endure. The trials announced not only guilt but inevitability, a slow and grinding declaration that sooner or later Bonnie and Clyde would be silenced not as individuals, but as the myth that had defied the system for too long. The day the verdict came down, the world seemed smaller, heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of inevitability. The courthouse smelled of worn wood and ink, a faint bitterness lingering from days of testimony and whispered rumors. Outside, the sun filtered weakly through clouds, casting long shadows across steps crowded with spectators and press alike. Men and women murmured among themselves, their voices low but persistent, carrying both satisfaction and sorrow, a reminder that justice was never a solitary act but a chorus of collective judgment. Inside, the accused sat rigid, their hands clasped, eyes scanning the room for signs of mercy that never arrived. Clyde's jaw tightened, a small tremor betraying the tension he tried to mask. Bonnie's gaze drifted downward, fingertips brushing the edges of her notebook. Her poems stilled by the reality surrounding her. They were no longer merely lovers or fugitives. They had become symbols, condensed into the black and white certainty of legal judgment. The words spoken by the judge, measured and unyielding, fell like hammers, each one striking at the fragile hope that perhaps the world could still bend to them. The sentence itself was not unexpected. Lawmen had ensured that the scales tilted in their favor, carefully gathering evidence and testimony, often amplified by the public's own appetite for vengeance. The jury, influenced by headlines and the atmosphere of fear cultivated over months of pursuit, had little reason to hesitate. The verdict was a logical conclusion, though it carried a weight far beyond the courtroom. It was a public declaration that the myth, the romance of speed and rebellion, would not endure, that the lovers who had danced with fate would now face the consequences of a society unwilling to forgive or forget. The aftermath rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. Friends who had lingered too long disappeared, fearful of association with those branded by the state. Relatives who had offered shelter now recoiled, wary of the shadow that had fallen upon them. The community itself seemed to exhale collectively, relieved that the threat had been constrained, yet not entirely freed from the anxiety that lingered like smoke from a fire that had burned too close to home. The public's fascination remained, but it was tinged with the sober understanding that the end had come not in the romance of legend, but in the slow, grinding machinery of law. Clyde, in the quiet of his confinement before transfer, reflected on the slow inevitability of the sentence. He understood that the chase, the speed, the careful mapping of roads and exits could only delay the consequences. Each mile he had driven, each town he had passed through, had been a temporary reprieve. Now, confronted with the permanence of law, he felt the weight of mortality settle deeper into his chest. There was anger, yes, but it was coupled with a clarity that had eluded him during months of endless flight. Survival had always been a game of instinct. Now, acceptance became a necessity. Bonnie remained at his side, her strength tempered by exhaustion and the quiet mourning of a future that would never arrive. She had always written of freedom in the cadence of tires on backroads and the fleeting warmth of fires in barns. Now, the pages she carried were heavy with the knowledge of consequence, inked with the tension of inevitability. In her verses, she traced the contours of hope and despair, noting how closely the two intertwined, how swiftly the world could shift from motion to stillness. The law, for its part, moved deliberately, but without malice beyond procedure. Officers and clerks processed the judgment as part of their duty, aware that the public's gaze weighed as heavily as the scales of justice. Every signature, every document, every transfer of custody was executed with care, ensuring that the machinery of consequence operated without flaw. The meticulousness of bureaucracy contrasted sharply with the chaotic freedom Bonnie and Clyde had known, emphasizing that the end of myth often comes not with spectacle, but with procedural certainty. In the small moments between judgment and transfer, Bonnie and Clyde confronted the subtle tragedies of human connection. They exchanged quiet words, reflections on choices, and brief touches that reminded them of a bond unbroken by law, though strained by circumstance. Even in the face of inevitability, love remained a source of solace, a fragile sanctuary amid the cold reality of confinement. The recognition that survival was no longer an option allowed a different intimacy to surface, one born of shared understanding rather than defiance. Outside the walls, the public processed the sentence in its own way. Conversations in diners and barbershops, whispers in train stations and general stores, carried echoes of relief, fascination, and grief. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer, eager to understand the allure of speed, rebellion, and danger, even as adults tried to reconcile the thrill of legend with the gravity of consequence. Newspapers chronicled every step of the process, every transfer, every whispered rumor, ensuring that the memory of the trial extended far beyond the immediate courtroom. Even as confinement began, the psychological toll remained evident. Mind, once dominated by planning and escape, now grappled with introspection and regret. The freedom he had once measured in miles of open road became a series of abstract concepts, existing only in memory or imagination. Bonnie mirrored this. Reflection, her creativity channeling both lament and quiet resilience. Together, they navigated the delicate balance between memory and reality, clinging to the remnants of a life defined by motion, love, and the pursuit of fleeting freedom. The immediate aftermath emphasized not only the end of their public defiance, but also the beginning of a different kind of trial, one internal, psychological, and intimate. Confinement brought reflection, the weighing of choices, and the understanding that consequence had arrived not merely in punishment, but in the reshaping of identity itself. Their legend persisted, but it was now refracted through the lens of law, mortality, and the recognition that every path eventually reaches its terminus. In the quiet of their separation from the road, in the dim corridors of custody, and the muted clatter of keys and footsteps, Bonnie and Clyde confronted both mortality and legacy. Their story, once defined by motion, myth, and defiance, now took on a new dimension, one that considered not only survival but consequence, not only love but loss. Even as the world moved on outside the walls, they remained suspended in the knowledge that the chase was over and the judgment irrevocable. The walls were higher than any fence or barn they had ever known, cold concrete and iron bars forming a grid that confined both body and mind. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp stone, carrying the subtle bitterness of confinement into every corner. Lights flickered in a rhythm that mirrored the monotony of their days, casting long shadows that stretched across the floors like reminders of a world they could no longer touch. In these corridors, time moved differently, measured not by miles or speed, but by the slow passing of routines, the careful observance of schedules, and the muted echo of footsteps. Clyde adjusted quickly, though not without tension. He rose before the first bell, noting the order of the guards and the cadence of meals, mapping the smallest patterns in a mind trained for observation and escape. The freedom he had once measured in miles now existed in the careful calibration of daily activity. He learned when to speak and when silence offered more protection than words, when to eat and when restraint was safer. His body, once attuned to constant motion, found a new rhythm in the limited space. Muscles coiled and ready despite the restrictions imposed upon them. Bonnie adapted in her own way. She carried notebooks and pencils, her mind creating worlds, where speed and motion still existed, where verse and story could stretch beyond the bars. Poetry became her companion, a way to navigate the monotony and to preserve the memory of a life lived on the road. She observed the routines of the other inmates, the subtle power structures that governed the flow of movement and information. Every gesture, every glance became a lesson in survival. Every whispered conversation a potential guide to avoid conflict and maintain a sense of agency within confinement. The days unfolded in strict order. Morning bells called them to breakfast, a measured cadence of footsteps and hushed voices filling the dining hall. Work assignments followed, simple yet monotonous tasks designed to keep the mind occupied and the body under supervision. Clyde noted the hierarchy among inmates, the small systems of influence and submission, the subtle strategies by which men asserted dominance without inciting outright conflict. He observed quietly, cataloguing details that might prove useful. In navigating this new, constrained world, Bonnie spent hours reading, writing, and walking the narrow corridors, each step a meditation. She carried fragments of verse and memory, turning the monotony into ritual. Every morning she wrote of roads no longer traveled, of sunlight falling across dust and metal, of nights filled with the low hum of engines fading into darkness. These exercises became a rhythm, a way to reclaim some small measure of freedom even when the world itself had been reduced to walls, bars, and narrow hallways. Meals were predictable yet significant. The taste of food, often bland and poorly prepared, became a marker for time, a signal that the day had moved forward without incident. Conversations were cautious, every word weighed for meaning and implication. Trust remained fragile, the lessons of betrayal lingering in every interaction. Guards watched with professional detachment, yet their presence was a constant reminder that movement had limits, and that every action was observed and recorded. The nights carried a different weight. Lights dimmed, though never fully extinguished, leaving shadows to creep along the walls and floors. The quiet became almost unbearable at first, until it was absorbed into the mind like a slow, steady pulse. Clyde would sit in the corner of the cell, eyes scanning the darkness, imagining routes and exits that no longer existed, and in that practice he found a strange form of solace. Bonnie lay across the narrow bunk, reciting lines of poetry softly, letting the words shape the darkness into something tolerable, almost comforting. Interaction with others became a careful negotiation. Clyde and Bonnie observed the subtle social cues among inmates, learning which alliances could be cautiously tested and which would bring trouble. They discovered that even in confinement, human behavior followed predictable patterns, though filtered through fear and desire for control. The ability to read faces, anticipate reactions, and maintain composure became as vital here as it had been on the open road. Every step, every word, every gesture carried consequence. Time blurred as days stretched into weeks. The world beyond the prison walls existed only in memory and rumor, carried in whispers and smuggled newspapers. Clyde measured the distance of freedom not in miles, but in weeks and months, counting the days with a meticulous attention he had once reserved for escape planning. Bonnie measured it in verses, each stanza a reflection on the past and an exercise in hope, a way to maintain identity when every external marker of self had been removed. The adaptation was gradual. At first, confinement seemed unbearable, the silence pressing into their minds with relentless weight. Over time, however, routines became protective. They learned the rhythm of guards' rounds, the timing of meals, the ebb and flow of other prisoners' moods. Their bodies and minds recalibrated, finding small liberties in repetition and predictability. The barbed tension of the first days gave way to a quieter endurance, a recognition that survival here required patience and subtlety rather than speed and audacity. Even in the confines of prison, the psychological pressures persisted. Mind returned repeatedly to choices, to betrayals, to the paths not taken. He reflected on how proximity and speed had once been their greatest assets. Now their absence magnified loss. Bonnie considered the fragility of trust, the cost of attachment, and the way love endured under constraint. Both grappled with the paradox of freedom within confinement, the way the mind could soar even when the body was tethered. Sleep, when it came, was shallow at first, punctuated by dreams of roads, engines, and open skies. Yet over weeks, the rhythm of confinement induced its own. The predictable march of bells, meals, and work allowed body and mind to settle, each breath sinking to the soft cadence of routine. Shadows lengthened, fell across the cell, and receded again in a quiet cycle that became almost hypnotic. Even the fear and anxiety softened, transformed into an acceptance that was not peace, but a steady, enduring resilience. Within these walls, Bonnie and Clyde found ways to endure. Routine became ritual, poetry became sanctuary, observation became mastery. They adapted to the limits imposed, preserving self within constraint, identity within the watchful eyes of authority. The world beyond the walls faded into memory, yet within the repetition and quiet, they discovered the subtle architecture of survival life, defined not by speed and escape, but by observation, patience, and the endurance of mind and spirit. Time moved differently in the final years, slower yet heavier, marked by the quiet erosion of vitality and the steady advance of consequences. The sun no longer carried the promise of wide-open roads. It filtered through bars and barred windows, painting rectangles of light across cold floors and cracked walls. The warmth of afternoon softened against the chill of stone, and each day became a ledger of endurance, measured not in distance traveled, but in breaths taken, in muscles that creaked with memory, and in the quiet mind, slowly reckoning with the body's limitations. Clyde felt the weight of years in the stiffening of joints, the subtle tremor that crept into hands once steady with the precision of a mechanic and the instinct of a hunter. His once acute senses dulled in ways that frightened him more than any gun or trap could have. He noted the change in mirror reflections, the way shadows fell differently across his face, deepening the lines carved by stress and fear. The relentless pace of youth, the thrill of evasion, the intoxicating motion of escapade became memories tinged with loss. With longing for a freedom that would never return, Bonnie's vitality, too, began to ebb, though she carried it with the grace of acceptance. Her hands, once lively with verse and careful observation, stiffened with the quiet toll of confinement. Her breath came easier in moments of stillness, yet each inhalation carried the faint ache of time spent in shadows, away from sunlight and open spaces. Poetry remained her sanctuary, her way to stretch beyond the confines, yet she wrote with a gentler hand, a softer cadence, as if understanding that the body's limitations demanded a new rhythm of thought, reflection, and observation. They moved carefully through the routines that had once become habit. Meals, work, and the measured passages of daylight continued, but both noted the subtle shifts in the body, in the mind, and in the way interactions with others were framed by diminished strength. Conversations, once vibrant or tense, were now quieter, deliberate. Silence became a companion, and in silence they measured not only time but endurance, gauging what remained of themselves against the inexorable march of aging and confinement. Health challenges came slowly, then suddenly. Minor ailments that once could be ignored began to linger, sap strength, and weigh on spirits. Fatigue became deeper, bones ached more persistently, and simple exertions required pauses and planning. Clyde found his hands less nimble, memory occasionally faltering, and the instinctive vigilance of youth tempered by reflection, weariness, and the creeping inevitability of mortality. Bonnie observed these changes, noting them with quiet concern, her own body whispering similar warnings. Together, they adapted, not with panic, but with careful attention, finding dignity in the acceptance of limitation. The shadows in their quarters lengthened with each passing day, echoing the weight of years. Light slanted differently across walls, casting patterns that reminded them of roads never traveled and times long past. Windows framed a world forever, just out of reach, trees swaying in rhythm with breezes they could only imagine, birds tracing arcs that no longer belonged to them. Even in confinement, nature pressed in, reminding them that time moved on beyond stone and iron, that seasons turned even when motion was restricted. Visits from the outside world dwindled. Friends, distant family, and occasional sympathizers had long since withdrawn, leaving only the routine of guards, clerks, and fellow inmates to mark the passage of days. The silence between these interactions became meditative, a rhythm of reflection. Clyde thought often of missteps, of trust misplaced, of freedom lost in the interplay of law, betrayal, and circumstance. Bonnie turned to verse, writing of roads, sky, and memory, of the paradox of freedom captured in spirit even when denied in body. Even the smallest routines took on ritualized significance. Breakfast became a quiet meditation, movement through corridors a careful choreography to conserve energy, moments of rest transformed into exercises in presence and awareness. They learned to sense patterns in the day, to anticipate shifts in light, noise, and activity, finding solace in predictability, while acknowledging the fragility of health and life itself. Each breath, each deliberate motion became a claim to agency in a world defined by limits. Reflection deepened in these years. Clyde considered not only the consequences of actions, but the texture of life, the interplay of fear, love, and mortality. Every missed mile, every fallen comrade, every betrayal that had once threatened immediate survival now weighed differently, seen through the lens of time and diminishing capacity. Bonnie contemplated the meaning of loyalty, of attachment, of beauty and loss, recording observations and memories with a soft hand, aware that these fragments might be the only trace left of their existence. The inevitable approach of death became a quiet, persistent presence. Each shadow carried subtle warning, each ache a reminder that the body could not indefinitely endure. They neither rushed nor despaired. Rather, they observed, measured, and adapted, finding dignity in the process. Clyde sometimes traced the sunlight patterns on the floor, imagining the open road stretching beneath a sky he could no longer traverse. Bonnie followed his gaze, her words unspoken but felt, carrying empathy and shared recognition of the body's limitations and the mind's capacity for endurance. Death, when it came, was sudden yet inevitable, an echo of the years spent under pursuit and confinement. It did not arrive as a shock to those who had long anticipated the slowing of time and motion, but as the natural terminus of a life spent on the edge, both in motion and in mind. In its arrival there was no triumph, no spectacle, only the quiet finality that marked the end of a chapter, the closing of a door, the stilling of breath that had once raced with speed, fear, and devotion. In the soft aftermath, the prison walls seemed even more permanent, a silent witness to endurance, adaptation, and finality. Friends long gone, routines now meaningless, the body at rest, only memory persisted. Light and shadow continued to trace across stone, indifferent to the human struggle, yet echoing faintly the lives that had unfolded within the confines. Even in death, the pattern of observation, reflection, and awareness lingered, a testimony to the depth of presence Bonnie and Clyde had maintained throughout life, flight, and consequence.